Good. So, brothers and sisters, our New Testament reading today then is the 23rd chapter of Matthew's Gospel, and I'm going to read to you the first 12 verses. Then Jesus said to the crowds and to his disciples, "The scribes and the Pharisees sit on Moses' seat. Therefore, do whatever they teach you and follow it. But do not do as they do. They do not practice what they teach. They tie up heavy burdens, hard to bear, and lay them on the shoulders of others. But they themselves are unwilling to lift a finger to move them. They do all their deeds to be seen by others, for they make their phylacteries broad and their fringes long. They love to have the best place of honor at banquets and the best seats in the synagogues, and to be greeted with respect in the marketplaces, and to have people call them rabbi. But you are not to be called rabbi, for you have one teacher, and you are all students. And call no one your father on earth, for you have one Father, the one in heaven. Nor are you to be called instructors, for you have one instructor, the Messiah. The greatest among you will be your servant. All who exalt themselves will be humbled, and all who humble themselves will be exalted." This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. So, laying heavy burdens on the shoulders of others. I really like the picture. I think it's a good image of what Jesus is talking about here. Taking things that are supposed to be good and helpful, useful things, and instead packaging them in such a way that they become a tremendous burden for somebody, putting it on their shoulders, and then going off and doing the exact opposite. So what Jesus was experiencing. So we're still situated in the temple for this dialogue that Jesus has started, and we know that that's important because when something is said in the temple, it takes on a kind of special, sacred, holy note because of where it is. I mentioned this morning, it's a little bit like in church. You know how like in church you're not supposed to swear, but if you go outside into the parking lot, it's fine. It's sort of a little bit like that. The place itself conveys a certain holiness that one's supposed to adhere to. So it is with the temple in these stories. Now, last week, as we left Jesus there in the temple, we were talking about how to live out the Great Commandment, about loving God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and loving your neighbor as yourself, which we formulated into two questions. How will we love God with all that we are and all that we have? Which is what the first bit really means. And then how will we love others? Not just the neighbor, but also the stranger, the alien, maybe even the enemy, as much as we love ourselves. So that's where we left it last time. And now we have Jesus say to the crowds and to his disciples that the scribes and the Pharisees sit on Moses' seat. So that presumably meant something to them. Do whatever they teach you and follow it. Don't do as they do, for they don't practice what they teach. It's an accusation of hypocrisy. So the thing about the Pharisees sit on Moses' seat is no doubt a reference to the Exodus story. In chapter 18 of the book of Exodus, we hear that Moses sat as a judge for the people, and the people stood around him from morning until evening. So sitting on Moses' seat is a way of saying act as a judge. And the judges in those days were judging about Torah, not secular laws. They didn't do that. So the judge is somebody you might go to and say, I know I'm not supposed to work on the Sabbath, but my donkey has fallen into a ditch. Is it okay if I lift him out? It will be hard work. And you're not supposed to work on the Sabbath. What should I do? And the judge will tell you what to do. That's the idea. So Jesus says that whatever they teach you, you're supposed to follow it. Well, indeed, in Deuteronomy 17, it says you should consult with the Levitical priest and the judge who is in office, you must carry out fully the law they interpret for you. So, if the person sitting on Moses' seat says, well, it's fine to go get your donkey out of the ditch, then you go and do it. But if he says, no, you mustn't do that, that would be a violation of God's law, then you're supposed to obey him. By the way, in that particular case, what the judge would have said is, go get the donkey. There's no doubt about that. And then we're told they don't practice what they teach. So one author writing about this, I thought, put it very nicely. T.W. Manson wrote, the Pharisees increased the number of ways in which a man may offend God, but they did nothing to enable a man to please God. So the point of the Torah and adherence to Torah is to do things that are pleasing to God. But if you pile them on people, especially things that it's impossible for them to do, well, all you do is you burden and burden and burden the people. You increase the number of ways that they could offend God. So, and then on top of all of that is the accusation of hypocrisy. They don't practice what they teach. And as we've said many times, to call somebody a hypocrite, the word hypocrite in Greek is the same as the word for actor, hence the masks. And that's pretty much one of the nastiest things you could say to somebody around the time of Jesus. There are a few other things that are equally nasty. You could refer to somebody as a snake. So like when Jesus says, you brood of vipers, that's also an incredibly insulting thing to say to somebody. Calling somebody a hypocrite or an actor was also an incredibly insulting thing. Of course, we read over it because it doesn't sound insulting to us, does it, to say, oh, the person's an actor. But in those days, that was about as nasty as it got. So think of the worst thing you could ever say to somebody. That's this. The idea of not practicing what you teach. Jewish writers, for example, Rabinovitz, in one of his articles, says the reason that hypocrisy is such a problem is it's very easy to get there. You start off with Torah, and then you apply it legalistically. So you burden people with it. And then, because that's so burdensome, you don't do it yourself. And so you're telling people to do something, and then you're not doing it yourself. So it's a short journey from legalism to hypocrisy, as he says. And that's what Jesus is seeing with these folks. I love this passage. They tie up heavy burdens, hard to bear, and lay them on the shoulders of others. And the church has quite a history of taking rules and regulations, tying them up, and putting them on the shoulders of people. We really do. We have a history of doing that. Jesus, of course, is talking about making the Torah a burden for ordinary people. Today, we might talk about making the entire biblical narrative that is supposed to deliver good news, turning it into bad news instead. So if you want some examples of this, and if you're a reader, there are two books that I think are really worth looking at here. The one, see on your left, on the yellow cover, Year of Biblical Womanhood, is a book by Rachel Held Evans, who was really a shining light, a voice in evangelical Christianity, a young woman, and then suddenly she died. It was quite unexpected. She was very young and she passed away, and it was a huge loss to the Christian community when Rachel Held Evans died. And she wrote this book, The Year of Biblical Womanhood. And there's another book called The Year of Living Biblically by a guy called Jacobs. Jacobs is, what's the right word, a journalist, I guess. A journalist, writes blogs and articles and things like that. He's not a religious person at all. Somehow he stumbled across the idea that Jewish people say that their Old Testament has some 613 rules laws in it. And he decided it would be fun to explore these 613 laws. So what he did, he started reading the Bible at page 1. And when he came across something that he thought was a rule, he said, okay, I'm going to adopt that. And then the next day he kept reading until he found another one. And then he added that second one. And then until he found a third one, then he added the third one. So he added these rules one at a time. And the book is his very comical description of trying to live out the 613 rules, laws, commandments, ordinances, whatever they are, in Torah. So just as an example, one of my very favorite ones was eventually he came to the part in the book where it says that somebody who commits adultery should be stoned. Remember that passage? Yeah? It's a famous passage, not from its place in the Old Testament, but because Jesus addresses it with the story of the woman caught in adultery. Although where the man was in that, I'm not sure, because there was obviously two of them. So in this story, so what the guy does, he's living in New York, is he goes out to Central Park, and he just walks up to people and says, excuse me, have you ever committed adultery? Well, you can imagine people's reactions to this, right? He got all sorts of weird reactions. In the end, he found somebody who just said, well, actually, yes, I have committed adultery. I've been thinking and fretting about it ever since. And he said, would you mind if I threw this stone at you? And then I was like, what? And he said, well, I'm supposed to stone somebody who's committed adultery. And the guy said, no, okay, go ahead. And we go, and he just tosses the pebble, hits the guy, moves to the floor. And then he went home and check, done that one. So it's kind of a comical one. But some of the ones that had real impact on him, first of all, he came across the rule that says you're not supposed to wear clothing that's made out of two different types of thread, two different types of fabric. And so he looked in his closet and he thought, well, how do you know? How do you know? So that's going to be hard to tell. I don't know how to do that. So he called the synagogue, a local synagogue, and talked to the rabbi and said, how do I tell? And the rabbi said, oh, we have a guy. We have a guy. And he said, what do you mean you have a guy? He said, we have someone who does it. I said, here's his number, call him. So he calls this guy on the phone. The guy shows up at his apartment with a great big suitcase, which when you open it up, inside. So he then takes a sock and he puts some drops of something on it. If there's cotton in it, it goes blue, and something else, if there's wool in it, it goes red. The color tests, in chemistry, very common things. And he had the guy go through his entire wardrobe, every single piece of clothing he had. And he didn't have one single thing that was only made out of one type of thread. Nothing. So he took all of his clothes, put them in garbage bags, tied them up, put them out for the trash, and informed his wife he was going to have to go and buy all new clothes for the purpose of obeying this law. And then he said to him, while we're at it, I need to talk to you about you not sitting on the sofa. There's a certain time, the Old Testament obsession with body fluids. There's a certain time you should sit on the floor. Well, can you imagine how well this went over with his wife? I think the rest of the book, he wound up sleeping in the spare room because of this. So it's a humorous thing, but it's about how the laws can become a burden on people. And then Rachel Levin's book is a similar thing, only told in a much more serious vein, because if you read through the Old Testament laws and you think about how burdensome they might be to men and to women, I think you'd quickly conclude that women get the short end of the stick in this deal. There are lots of rules in there that are very burdensome and difficult for women. And so she talked about all of those sorts of things in her book. So either of those, if you ever see one, you might want to pick it up and read it. Very easy to read, and at least the one on your right, it's funny too. Yes.
You can get one in the library, and they're fun.
Yes, they are, aren't they? Yes. The Year of Living Biblically, the one by Jacob. So at the end of the book, he spent a whole year doing this. As I said, he started off as an agnostic at best. And at the end of the book, he hasn't become converted to Judaism or to Christianity or anything like that. But he says the experience of trying to follow these rules made him aware of certain aspects of the transcendent, of the divine, the spiritual, that he had never encountered before. And so even for him, it was a transformative experience doing this. So those are both good things to take a look at when you're thinking about what are all these rules and what am I supposed to do with them? Clearly telling your wife that she needs to sit on the floor and not on the sofa, don't do that. That sounds like a terrible idea, doesn't it? So, interesting stuff. Now, back to our story, and we see equivalent sorts of things, only described in ways that would be very meaningful to the Jewish people at the time of Jesus, but which might mean almost nothing to us today. For example, they do all their deeds to be seen by others, for they make their phylacteries broad and their fringes long. Well, unless you're really up to date on phylacteries and fringes, it won't mean anything, will it? But a phylactery, first of all, that comes from the Greek word. The corresponding Hebrew word is tephilim. And tephilim are tiny little boxes, probably inch by an inch by an inch, that have ribbons attached to them. And inside the little box is a tiny little scroll that has a portion of Torah. And you take the box, you put it on the back of your hand, and then with the ribbon, you wind it and you tie it onto your hand. Or there's another one that you put in the middle of your forehead, and with the ribbons, you tie it onto the middle of your forehead. The picture shows the guy doing that. I know it's a little hard to see, but you might be able to see on his arm at least black bands that are ribbon. There's a little box on the back of his hand. So there are two types of tefillin here. There are arm tefillin, shel yad, and head tefillin, shel rosh, from the words yad, arm, and rosh, head, in Hebrew. Now, why on earth would somebody do this? Well, they do it because Deuteronomy says so. In Deuteronomy 11, you shall put these words of mine in your heart and soul, and you shall bind them as a sign on your hand and fix them as an emblem on your forehead. And so the Jewish people at the time of Jesus did that, and Jewish people in some strands of Judaism to this day do this. Yeah. Now, we're also told to make their phylacteries broad. What does that mean if it's bound to the back of your hand and on your head? Well, in Deuteronomy 6, remember this is like the most famous part of the Torah to Jewish people. Deuteronomy 6, the prayer, Shema Yisrael, hear, O Israel. And it goes on and it says, keep these words I'm commanding you today in your heart, bind them as a sign on your hand, fix them as an emblem on your forehead, and write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. So you expand it beyond your person to the entire place that you live. And so you make it broad in that sense. And today, often if you go to somebody's house and they're an observant Jew, they will have by their door it's usually a brass little thing there. And if you were to reach in it, which you shouldn't do because it would be considered rude and intrusive, but if you did, you could pull out a tiny little Torah scroll, that has a verse of Torah on it that's important to the family, and they have them on their doorposts of their houses and apartments still today. So, and you're also supposed to make your fringes long. This has nothing to do with your hair coming down into your eyes, making your fringes long. It's not about that at all. What it's about, fringes, or Hebrew tzitzit, which is a great word. You should practice saying tzitzit. Tzitzit are found on every four-cornered garment that's worn by a practicing Orthodox Jew. Today, most of the clothing that we wear doesn't have four distinct corners. Like, say, a pair of jeans, you might hold it up and there's the waist, there's two corners. But then at the bottom, there's two legs, so there's like four corners at the bottom. One hole at the top, two holes at the bottom, kind of strange. So what people do is they just dress in their normal clothes and then they take a rectangular piece of cloth that clearly has four corners and they put fringes on the four corners and wear it usually like a sort of stole or shawl, like the one in the picture. And you can see the 4 tassels coming down from the corners. Why do they do this? Because the book of Numbers says so. The Lord said to Moses, "Speak to the Israelites and tell them to make fringes on the corners of their garments throughout their generations." That means not just the people that have been spoken to, but everybody from then on. To put a blue cord on the fringe at each corner. And this is the important bit that was so irritating to Jesus. Why would you do that? You have the fringe so that when you see it, you will remember all the commandments of the Lord and do. It doesn't say you put this thing on, I put this thing on so that you can see it and that you will now start following the law because I am wearing the garment with the fringes. No, I'm wearing it to remind myself, not to point at you and say, well, you should be doing this, right? It's about the wearer, not the viewer. And so you'll see in Jesus's passages, what's irritating him is people doing things just so other people can see them. And that's not the point at all. The purpose is to remind the wearer of the Torah, not the people who see the wearer. And you see this over and over again in these passages where these strange practices are done. They're not done for somebody else to see. They're done for you, to help you remember. Every time you look down and you see blue tassels, it makes you remember, oh, the law, the Torah. You will remember all the commandments of the Lord and do them. But it's about you. It's not about someone else. So part of this, of course, made the Jewish people stand out from everybody else. They were different from everybody else, wearing these things, boxes, shawls, fringes, all of that sort of thing. And Jesus's call to be different really extends a long way. So you're not to be called rabbi, for example. Why not? Well, because you're to have one teacher, you're all students. This is all about avoiding that pathway that takes you from legalism to hypocrisy, and then from hypocrisy to pride, because you become proud that you have the shawl with the fringes on it, that you have the very best tefillin on the back of your hand and on your head. And you forget completely that you're doing these things as a reminder to you, not a reminder to everybody else. I view all of this as, at its fundamental level, as a call to allegiance. Call no one your father on earth. Why not? Because you only have one allegiance, and that's to your Father in heaven. You're not to be called an instructor, you only have one instructor, that's the Messiah. So it's about allegiance to God the Father, who's made known to us in the person of Christ Jesus, the Messiah. This allegiance, how is it made known? Well, one of these tricky little things that Jesus says, this aphorism here, the greatest among you will be your servant. All who exalt themselves will be humbled, and all who humble themselves will be exalted. It's one of those passages that sounds nice, and you think about it for a minute, you think, faintest idea what that is actually all about here. But it's about exalting yourself compared with humbling yourself. So you could look at that in terms of being self-serving, exalting yourself, or serving others, being humble yourself. And in that way, I think it relates directly to and call about loving your neighbor, the stranger, even loving your enemy here. It brings us right back to the Great Commandment. How will we love God with all that we are and all that we have? And how will we love others as much as we love ourselves? The last one being the one that Jesus just referenced here. So this question about ultimate allegiance and how do you live it out here, Jesus frames it in terms of being overly self-serving or serving others. Now, being self-serving is not entirely bad in and of itself, because you're told to love your neighbor as yourself. So you're encouraged to love yourself. to see that you have value. Of course you do. You're made in the image of God. But you're also encouraged to serve others, to love your neighbor. And you have to balance those two things and not let them get completely out of whack with each other. And the question of ultimate allegiance is alive and well today. I'll look at it this way. I think this is true, that those of us in the room, would all agree that the world has got serious problems. And we might not exactly align on what they are, and we might not align on what to do about them. But I think we'd all agree that they're there, that there's a lot of problems in the world. And so where should we look for solutions to our problems? Should we look for political solutions, economic solutions, military solutions? What type of solution to the world's problems should we be looking for? And Jesus, of course, has this radical idea that says you can solve all of the world's problems really simply by devoting yourselves to loving the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and mind, and then living that out in the world. That in itself will change the whole world. So how do you live it out in the world? Well, you love your neighbor as yourself. You love the alien or the stranger as yourself. Even love your enemies. That's a tough one. But what he's doing is proposing a kind of kingdom versus empire type of setup here. He proposes that it's not actually through allegiance to political, economic, military, or other social constructs, even though they may have a role to play. Ultimately, the way in which you change the world for the good is to join yourself to God's great story, which is, as we know, a love story. And you join yourself to God's love story by, first of all, making sure that you avoid the path to legalism that leads to hypocrisy, that leads to pride, and instead follow the path of servanthood and humility that's made known to us through the life and work of Christ Jesus. The thing about that path is, I think, that every step you take, every decision you make, no matter how tiny the decision is like a branch point. It's a turning point. It's a decision either for the kingdom or for the empire. I learned this. It just shows, sometimes you can really blind yourself to things here. We had a conversation, this is years ago now, I think you may remember it, but I started talking about drinking coffee. I love coffee. I drink coffee all the time, probably way too much. And I pointed out that when you stop and you buy a cup of coffee, you stop somewhere and you buy a cup of coffee. First of all, often in the place that you're buying it, they may have fair trade coffee and then other coffees. Which decision you make as to what to buy is a kingdom versus empire decision. If you buy the fair trade one, it's just a tiny little step towards the kingdom. If you buy the other one, it's a tiny little step towards the empire. And at the same time, and this was a real shocking realization to me, every time I bought a cup of coffee, I buy those styrofoam cups, that you get in gas stations and places, fill it up with coffee and drink it, throw it away. And I thought, well, that's not a good thing to do. I know what we'll do. We'll get travel mugs made at the church and we'll give them to everybody, which is what we did. And we gave away hundreds of travel mugs that had University Church written on them. And the place that I like to buy my coffee, strange as it sounds, is actually a gas station in my house. The place is absolutely spotless. They keep it spotlessly clean, and the coffee is fabulous. And one of those big styrofoam things of coffee, $1.20. Until the first time I went in with my travel, filled it up, took it to the checkout thing, and the person said, "Oh, Julian," because I go there all the time. And she says, 89 cents. And I said, no, it's coffee, $1.29. And she said, no, if you bring your own mug. So for years, literally years, every day, I had overpaid by 40 cents a cup every single day. And I'd been damaging the environment, throwing these things away. doing those things are all steps towards the empire, right? And I wanted to be taking steps towards the kingdom. So I started using the travel mug and making sure I use fair trade coffee and then rinsing it out and using it again and again and again until it fell to pieces. Tiny decisions, but you make them all the time, tiny decisions. And if you think about them, you'll realize that these tiny decisions really, really matter. And the thing about it is, as far as I know, we each only have the one life to live here on earth. And we get to choose which path we're going to take through all of these tiny little decisions. And when you do that, you declare to the world where your allegiance lies. It either lies with the kingdom of God or with the empire of Herod, the empire of Rome. Every step matters. Back in the Old Testament times, there's a scene in the book of Joshua where Joshua gathers all of the tribes together and he gives them a little mini lecture. And he says, now, if you're unwilling to serve the Lord, so you're not going to make kingdom decisions, choose this day whom you will serve. Because when you don't serve the Lord, it's not that you serve nothing. You serve something else. And the something else is the empire. Choose this day whom you will serve. And then he gives what to him would have been examples of empire thinking. Gods your ancestors served in the region beyond the river, beyond the Euphrates, or the gods of the Amorites. And then he says, but as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord. We will try and make kingdom decisions, not empire decisions. So let me wrap this up by pointing out that what he says is choose when? This day. That's today. That's right now for us. Choose right now whom you will serve, because tick-tock, the clock's ticking. We've just got the one life to live, as far as I know. We get to choose a path, we get to choose our allegiance, and time, of course, shows us what really matters. And so Jesus' funny conversation about phylacteries and fringes, and it sounds so strange and so weird, those are all about choosing a path, reminding yourself continually what the path is, making these micro decisions that lead you in the right direction. I think it's a helpful thing to find some way of reminding ourselves on an ongoing basis. I'm not proposing that we all wear little boxes strapped to our foreheads. Some of us, though, might wear a cross around our neck, something like that. Something that's a physical reminder, helps you focus on which decisions to make and how to make them. And that, I think, is what Jesus was getting at in this conversation.